Hello, welcome to this week's talk from the Bury St Edmunds Buddhist Centre. This week it's my turn to tell you why I'm a Buddhist. This could be quite a long story, but I won't make it long. But I have been a Buddhist for, getting on for 30 years now. That's, let's say, consciously and deliberately a Buddhist. And I've been an ordained Buddhist into the Tree Rat and the Buddhist order. That's what this kesa around my neck signifies, with the symbols of the three jewels on it. And hence my name as an ordained Buddhist, Abhayavajra. And I've been ordained since 1995, so I'll let you do the maths on that if you're interested. But in telling this story, how and why I'm a Buddhist, I'm going to go back a long time, way back into the distant past, to when I was maybe 9, maybe 10 years old, so many years ago. Summer holiday, hot summer sunny weather. We lived on the edge of town, quite close to fields and woods, and they were our playing place, our playground. I was by myself. Probably, if the farmer knew, he wouldn't be very pleased, but I'd found my way into the middle of a sort of fully ripe cornfield, and I was lying on my back in the sun. And I don't think I was doing anything else, just looking up at the sun, at the sky. But I can remember now this experience, this feeling that I had then, many, many years ago. And it was an experience of just feeling completely contented. I can sort of vaguely think, I didn't have words for it then, but that I was completely happy. I was completely happy being there, doing nothing. I could feel the warmth of the sun, maybe hear the sounds of birds, etc. But the whole experience was one of spaciousness and a sort of feeling of expansiveness, and a feeling that I myself was dissolving into my environment, what was around me. If you like, my edges were softening. Well, that's it. I mean, I don't know how long that experience lasted. I got up and probably ran home for tea. But the memory is still with me now, and it has sort of come back to me at various times during the past. Looking back now, I think one thing that experience gave me, I don't know how unusual it was for me or for other people. Maybe you have an experience, something like that you can relate to. But one thing it did, I think, looking back, it gave me a sort of particular perspective, a particular feeling of relationship with what my normal everyday experience was. And I think growing up and into adulthood, probably like a lot of people, my general everyday experience wasn't one of contentment, wasn't one of feeling just happy to be doing nothing, being where I was. It wasn't one of spaciousness or a feeling of myself softening. I think, a lot of the time my experience is something of the opposite of all of those things. A kind of experience of life, of trying to get things, to trying to do things, experiencing the world as quite often being a bit of an obstacle, maybe feeling my own limitations, who I was and what I could do or couldn't do as, well, as a limitation, an obstacle to me and myself. Anyway, that was many years ago. Fast forward 30 years, roughly. Okay, so I'm actually still not a Buddhist. Was working in the theatre in London. I was, as a painter, as an artist, I was also working sometimes on stage scenery and sets and painting, including big multi-million pound productions and things. This was it could be quite exciting. It was very demanding at times. If anyone's, some of you may have had experience of amateur dramatics, so you know what fun and tension and chaos they can be. Well, I can tell you, when you're kind of working in the sort of West End Theatre or the Royal Shakespeare Company or the Royal Opera House, it's no different, except you're surrounded by probably much larger, more flamboyant egos, and there's millions of pounds involved of someone's money. So the tension and the stresses were both exciting and sometimes a bit extreme. Now I'm telling you this because I used to work with someone who was a very good painter. We quite often worked on productions together. And I'll call him Steve. I call him Steve because that was his name. But Steve, and now I'm talking probably mid-80s, mid-1980s. Steve struck me and others with how sort of calm and measured and appropriate he seemed in his communication and dealing with, various challenges that arose. Quite unusually so. He was a nice bloke, but he also had this ability to just stay unruffled in the stormiest seas. So I knew that he had just sort of mentioned about meditation or something. And I remember one lunchtime down the pub, a little calm lull in the storms. I asked him about this. I said, I am struck by, your calmness in dealing with all of this. Is that to do with meditation, and what do you do and what's that about? Anyway, he proceeded to tell me about his meditation practice. And I did get the sense that he'd been doing it for, 20 years he'd been meditating. And this had given him some internal resources, that's how I understood it, to deal with what life threw at him. In his case, he had been following a Maharishi Hindu guru in India and been doing mainly transcendental meditation practices. His interpretation of the high point of his meditation was touching the feet of God. Well, God or not God, it certainly seemed to be providing him and those working with him, quite some benefits. And this stuck with me as well. I kind of had a sense of an aspiration. There was something about calmness, contentment, not feeling sort of hemmed in by things or fighting things that I responded to. And I responded to him telling me about meditation. But at that point I didn't have a sort of means, or if you like, as we would call it, a path for getting there myself. And then, perhaps it took me about 4 years to follow up some interest that had been sparked in me, and to go along to the London Buddhist Centre. This would be right at the end of 1990. I learnt to meditate. I went 2 evenings running. And most of you will be familiar with the meditation practices, the mindfulness of breathing and the metta bhavana. But after just 2 weeks of going, I started to get ill. In fact, I ended up getting extremely ill. And in fact, I ended up in hospital for a length of period. I had a very severe case of hepatitis. It took me a long time to recover from that as well. But, strange to relate, this hospitalisation, this complete sort of axe falling on my life and what I was trying to do in my life, with my painting, my art, my work in the theatre, at the time didn't seem such a dreadful thing. Well, it certainly was. It was a bit scary. I didn't know if I would survive. But at the same time, what came into my experience was a sense of spaciousness. It's as if, the space that had been taken up with my effortful life, that life was no longer in that space, and the space was empty. And what came into that space was Buddhism, was the Buddha's Dharma. A friend of mine, in fact the person who had managed to persuade me along to the meditation sessions in the first place, while I was in hospital, started lending me, in those days, it was cassettes, recordings of talks on the Dharma by Sangharakshita. I was also reading books, mainly by Sangharakshita, though I couldn't read for very long at a time. But I think mainly through the talks, I felt this communication. Through Sangharakshita, of something that just flooded into me, into that space that was me, that was my life. I immediately intuited everything I was hearing as true. Well, true in the sense that it seemed to answer my own experience. It seemed to fit my own experience, but gave me a better interpretation, a better perspective on my experience, on my life. So, at this point, being ill, not knowing whether I was going to recover, there arose, on the basis of all of that, really a strange sense of contentment that finally I could rest in something that I really felt was true, and something that would help me with my life, however long that life was. But I did survive, obviously, here I am. But after getting well enough to be active again, I started going back to the London Buddhist Centre, in fact, as often as I could. And in a very short space of time, I took what for me, a very sort of self-sufficient person who had been living by himself for a few years, quite a momentous step to move in and live in the community with, at that time, 14 other men at the London Buddhist Centre. I think I just wanted to throw myself behind what I perceived to be true and the truth, and to pursue that, with as much thoroughness as I could. And then the new life that I led, being at the London Buddhist Centre, living in the community, there's one thing I began to notice, that I was valuing communication. I was valuing conversation. I was valuing my connection with others, and particularly with other Buddhists, not exclusively, but particularly with the other Buddhists. So, it could be anyone. But if someone was open to communication and being honest, whether it was in study, whether it was work that I was doing around the London Buddhist Centre, whether it was one-to-one, sitting in a cafe or walking in the park or going on retreat, one thing I began to notice, that something would happen in communication, in conversation with other people. Perhaps it often happened before, but I hadn't noticed it before. But I think it was to do with this kind of sense of a certain sort of contentment that meant I knew and believed in what I was doing with my life now, even though I didn't know where that was going to lead. And because of that contentment, a certain relaxation and a softening, if you like, a softening of my edges, and an expansion of, well, myself, or a losing of myself in a positive way, whilst being in relation to other people. So for this to happen, I think firstly I had to discover more interest in other people. And then I think the clue is to pay others attention. And then be open to others, to what you hear and what you see and what you feel from them. And as I did this and took that on, in a way consciously as a practice, I began to sense that sometimes something would happen. It would be as if we would be talking. We could be talking about the Dharma, about the Buddha's teaching. We could be talking about anything. We could be talking about personal subjects. But if there was that initial interest and the attention was paid and there was openness, then what would arise would be a sense that there was something coming out of the conversation that was kind of bigger and possibly more truthful than the sum of our individual parts. And I think this is just communication. Communication happens when, our edges, our barriers, our limits that we both impose, and maybe the world imposes on us, of ourselves, just softens or becomes a bit permeable, or dissolves a little or crumbles. Okay. Then a bigger space opens up, and it opens up two people together. Okay. Paying attention to other people means that a bigger perspective can arise. And I think it's that sense of the possibility of communication, of what can take place between two people or a number of people, of human beings, what can happen between human consciousnesses, is what kind of led me to, becoming not just a Buddhist, but becoming an Ordained Buddhist. I think I wanted more of this. And I think I saw the Buddhist order, the Triratna Buddhist order that I was in closest contact with, as a very good and also a kind of consciously practicing context for deepening and broadening communication. And I think I wanted to, go beyond just benefiting from that, to doing something to help bring that about further, to nurture it, if you like. I'm not a gardener, but maybe a bit, I do enjoy gardens, but it's a bit like making that shift between just enjoying gardens and feeling impelled to want to create one or help create one yourself and to nurture one for others as well as yourself. And at some level I think that's what took me into the process necessary in order to be ordained. So these events I've described in my life, and there are probably others as well, I could see as openings, as portals into a slightly bigger, slightly truer, maybe even a freer perspective or way of being. Maybe just temporarily, but they would, return given the right conditions. The cornfield, when I was very young, something was communicating or trying to communicate with me there, and I think something in me heard, at least for a brief few minutes probably, through Steve. Something was being communicated to me about, meditation, about how consciousness can be refined, developed. There are possibilities in the way that we deal with life. And in the hospital, it felt like almost a direct communication of the Dharma. Almost, hopefully it doesn't sound too fanciful, from Sangharakshita, and through him from the Buddha himself. And I think that communication possibility is always there if I stop, get interested, pay attention and openness. And all those other conversations, maybe even with some of you, at various times. When something's just sort of sparked, or something's opened up, or there's a new understanding about myself, or about you, or about the world. All these are communications. I like to think that, if you like, reality, it's the way things are. It's trying to communicate with us. And I think it's to put myself in the best place and the best state of mind to take part in that communication, to take my part in it, is why, perhaps at first, not so consciously, but later more and more consciously, decided for me to be what I call a Buddhist. And now I've been talking to you. So maybe this is a communication. Well, it is a communication. And outside, the sun's shining. I can hear the trees outside blowing in the wind a bit, the poplar trees at Vajrasana. There's even it might be a cornfield, it might be a wheat field, I'm not sure, outside at the back. And they're all communicating too. They're all talking, if I listen. And if you listen too. So, take care, okay, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye.